So for those of you who may be new today, we're Axiomatics. We're the leader in dynamic authorization solutions, and we help enterprises and government agencies adopt a policy-based approach to access control. And we know ABAC. We've got two great speakers lined up today, Jerry Gebel and David Broussard. David is the Vice President of Customer Relations at Axiomatics, and he directs pre-sales, post-sales, and support teams. He brings experience at British Telecom in the Security Architecture Center, over 10 years of experience in distributed system security, software architecture design, and international project management, especially in the area of service-oriented architecture and identity and access management. So welcome, David. And Jerry Gebel is our president here at Axiomatics Americas. In addition, in this position, he contributes to product strategy and manages partner relationships for Axiomatics. Prior to joining us here, he was the vice president and service director for Burton Group's identity management practice. And in 2007, he facilitated the first ever XACML interoperability demonstration at the Catalyst Conference. In addition, he brings over 15 years of experience in the financial services industry, including architecture development, engineering, integration, the support of internet distributed and mainframe systems. So you are in great hands with these two experts, and I'll turn it over to them to get you started.
Thanks, Kelly, for that great intro. Appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. So it's kind of unusual because, well, David and I have worked together for, what, more than 6.5 years at Axiomatics. So few times are we actually together in the same room to do a webinar like this. So this actually might be a little unusual.
We like to keep a few thousand miles in between us.
At least. In any case, thanks again for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon. Since it is back to school time, all the little kids and older kids are going off to grammar school or high school or maybe college for the first time, we thought we would do a session on attribute-based access control from a basics perspective. So ABAC 101. Sound good, David?
That sounds good.
So here's what we'll cover in today's session, although I don't think we'll have a quiz at the end like you might ordinarily at school.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
We could? Okay. Maybe a pop quiz. All right, so let's start out by looking at some basic definitions and concepts here for attribute-based access control. And I'd like to start out with the definition from NIST, the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, which says here, grant or deny user requests based on arbitrary attributes of the user, the object, environment conditions, that may be globally recognized and more relevant to the policies at hand. So this is from the beginning summary of that special publication 800-162, which has been out now, what, a couple of years?
Yep, I think it was 2013 for the first draft.
Yeah, and it's a really good document. So we often recommend it as a great resource. And there's a lot of other good information in there, but this is a definition from that document. Now, when we talk about ABAC, we also use some other terms, other ways to describe it. And one of them is to say that it is a mode of externalized authorization. That is, we're taking the logic for the security and access control out of the application and installing it in a central service. So we're creating the policies and rules in that central service and managing the logic for access control there.
Which brings us to the second dimension, is that it's not only externalized, but also centralized access control.
Right.
And that's not new, by the way, Jerry. Other frameworks before ABAC have done this. Spring Security is an example of externalizing the access control or the authentication authorization side of things. Microsoft claim to achieve the same level of authorization as well. So it's definitely not a new principle, but ABAC extends it to a technology-neutral way of doing authorization.
Good point. And this idea of centralization doesn't mean in a physical sense. I mean, certainly you can have a physically centralized service, but you can also distribute it around the world into different data centers or or have some kind of hybrid model, so it's not rigid from that perspective.
It's more the management that's centralized. The deployment in itself could be a hybrid model.
Indeed. Then David, also we often say that XACML, or the Extensible Access Control Markup Language Standard, is an example of an ABAC system, and we think a really good one. So this also allows you for interoperability and getting the benefits of those kind of standard implementations. And XACML certainly has been around for a while, since at least 2003.
Right, and the first work started in 2001, and it's become since then the de facto policy language for ABAC.
And speaking of policies, that's an important aspect to bring up here, because attributes get all the attention. Of course, it is attribute-based access control, but policies really are the glue that ties all the attributes together, and that's what's used to express that logic for access control that we've been talking about.
Right. And some people will call attribute-based access control policy-based access control because they want to focus more on the policy side of things than the attributes themselves.
Right. Okay. So David, here's a school-based example that we'll talk about a little bit through this presentation. Do you want to describe some of this?
Sure. So very often what happens when we talk about ABAC to prospects and customers, what also comes to mind is RBAC, or role-based access control, also an authorization standard defined by NIST. It dates back to 1992. We have a couple of webinars on that topic. In RBAC, you assign users to roles and you assign permissions to roles as well. Therefore, users inherit the permissions from the fact that they belong to those roles. So as an example, here on the left-hand side, we have the teacher role, and we're going to assign the permission view student grades. What's interesting is that the permission is a course block, if you will. It's an aggregation of different semantic meanings. So it has view, the action, it has student grades, the resource, but they're all bundled together into a single string or a single permission. Another example here is teacher underscore art underscore department has the right to enter the art room. Actually, I forgot to write the word enter on the slide. Again, this is an example of a very specific role and a very specific permission. The second example, the reason why we put it down here is that it kind of hints at the fact that later down the road in RBAC, if you want to have fine-grained authorization, you might end up with issues that you'll mention later, Jerry, one of which is role explosion. Now on the right-hand side, we look at how ABAC would tackle similar examples. So instead of having a big course permission, we're going to break it down into the attributes we mentioned a minute ago. So we're going to say if the user has a teacher, the role teacher, then teachers can view or edit grades of students attending their course. So we're actually writing in plain old English and breaking down the roles and permissions into separate attributes. In a similar example right below, teachers can enter classrooms in their own department. Again, instead of having a specific role bound to the department of the teacher, we're actually breaking it down into different attributes.
So ABAC's less static, if you will, more dynamic
right.
nature as well. Okay, excellent. So then let's talk about some more of the key elements.
Correct.
You know, talk more about those attributes, for example.
So there's really two heroes in ABAC. So the first one is attributes and the second one is policies. So if we look at attributes, first of all, they're multi-dimensional. You mentioned in the NIST definition that attributes were about users, resource, I think they say context, and action, environment and action. So these are the many dimensions of attributes. They can describe users, objects, resources, time of the day, the environment, the action, many different things. They actually represent the different grammatical functions of a word in a sentence. The other aspect to attributes is that essentially they're just a key value pair. It's extremely simple. You have a name or an identifier and a value. For instance, role is equal to teacher, citizenship is equal to Swedish, so on and so forth. The values for those key value pairs can come from anywhere. They could come from in the architecture, in the ABAC architecture, they could come from the requester, the one sending the authorization request.
From the application.
From the application, correct. Or they could come from a back-end database, an Active Directory, a web service, anywhere you have that information stored and you want to consume. It does not matter where the information comes from. Attributes are typically typed, which makes for richer policies. So instead of having everything as string, you can actually introduce things like time, date, numbers, integers, doubles, so on and so forth, which makes for easier to understand policy. So now you can write a policy that says deny access to the school if the student is less than 4 years old, and 4 would be actually an integer. And finally, since these are key value pairs, nothing stops you from having multiple values per key value pair. So you could have multiple roles. You could be a teacher. You could also be a principal at the same time. And in the real world, that does happen. You can actually have 2 roles within a school.
Yeah, we often have blended responsibilities. That means we have different roles
Yep.
assigned to us.
Wearing multiple hats.
Right. All right, what about the policies?
So the second hero of ABAC is the policies, or the secret sauce that bring all the attributes together. They combine those attributes into the authorization requirements or authorization constraints, if you will. And they can combine them in any which way you like. There's no limit to how many attributes a policy can use. The policies, by combining those attributes together, they're going to be implementing the ABAC authorization requirements. And one of the key benefits of policy-driven authorization or policy-based access control is that the policies are a very good reflection of the original authorization requirements. And we'll touch on that in a couple slides.
Right, so they match those natural language statements
yes.
that we talked about earlier.
Yes. The policies, and that's quite new in ABAC, the policies can be both positive, they give you something, they give you access, but they can also be negative or restrictive, they can deny you access. So as an example here, you can say that teachers as a whole can enter classrooms in their own departments, okay? And then a more restricting policy relating to teachers as well would be that teachers cannot enter any classroom between, say, 10 p.m. and 6 p.m. because it's nighttime, and teachers shouldn't be at school during the night. The example.
10 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Did I say something else?
Yeah, 6 p.m.
Oh.
What about if you have to do an all-nighter and study?
Yeah, but you're not a teacher then, you're a student.
Okay. Good point.
But that's why students cannot enter the cafeteria after 2 p.m. because they should get back to work.
Great.
The other aspect to policies, and it kind of goes back to the example of granting denying, is that you can combine the policies together and decide which one wins over the other. So for instance, you could say that as a whole, teacher assistants can edit grades. That's the bottom line rule. If you're a teacher assistant, you're a student, you're going to be helping the teacher, and one of the tasks you're going to be doing is grading papers or editing grades. However, you don't want the teacher assistant to be able to change their own grades. That'd be cheating. So you're going to have another rule that says teacher assistants can't edit their own grades, and that's a restricting rule that will restrict the effect of the first one, and you combine the 2 rules together to make sure that the second one wins over, trumps the first one. Finally, kind of going back to the second statement we had on this slide, the implement statement, policies in ABAC are simply readable. They're natural policies, they're not artificial artifacts. So long as you build them on natural attributes, department, role, the time of day, so on and so forth, the policies will be readable. And that makes them easier to audit.
Excellent.
So, Jerry, let's have a look at an example here. We're going to work through a policy and break it down into the different attributes the policy is made of. So here we have teachers can enter classrooms in their department. What I typically tell our customers is pull out the highlighter and start in the key words. Teachers is going to be a role, okay, subject. Enter is going to be the action, so that's going to be an action attribute. Classroom is the object we're trying to do the action on. We're trying to enter a classroom. That's going to be the resource attribute. And then here, Jerry, we've got a bit of a weird one. What would you think their department is?
Well, this is what we describe as a relationship, right?
Right. A relationship between the user and the resource. So what we're going to do is break it down into 2 separate attributes, the user's department and the resources or the classroom's department.
Right, and then, David, I know you often describe that you have to determine or define where these attributes come from. You talked about this a little bit earlier.
Yes.
And so it could come from the application, from some kind of repository. And, sorry. And one other thing here is that this is the logic that ordinarily you would have to hard code into the application.
Right.
But in the ABAC example, we can now, this is part of externalizing that logic into the policy language, right?
Which is actually a really interesting point. It means that the application, all it needs to know are the key attributes, the user identity, the object type, the action. So in other words, the question the app can send could state, can Alice enter classroom number 1? And the fact that Alice is an arts teacher and that classroom number 1 is a physics lab, that's not part of the question, and it does not matter. What happens is when you're going to be looking at the policy, you'll retrieve the missing information in order to be able to make a decision. It means that you can make the policy change and add additional parameters or additional attributes without having to rewrite the app and having to add the additional information within the app, since the policy engine itself will figure out the missing information.
Great. So on the application side, keep things simple and
Yep.
lightweight,
Yep.
and let the ABAC system handle all that logic.
Correct.
Perfect. And then next, we just flashed this up here a moment ago, the architecture. So this is generally representative of an ABAC architecture as well, right, David?
Yes, absolutely. This is the typical ABAC architecture. The terms themselves, PEP, PDP, PIP, I believe they all predate ABAC. They all predate XACML as well. XACML uses the same terminology. So the PEP is your policy enforcement point. It resides within the app or in front of the app in some way. It's deployed within the app environment so that it can intercept the flow, the business request between the client, be it a user or another app, and the targeted application. And the policy enforcement point, the PEP, is responsible for converting the business request, here point number 1, view record 123, into an authorization request. Can Alice view record 123? And the PEP is going to send that off to the core, to the authorization engine called the policy decision point, or PDP, in the ABAC architecture. The PDP is that component that will look at the incoming authorization request, look at the policies it's been configured with, the ABAC policies, and then look at potentially fetching additional missing attributes from policy enforcement information points. Like we said a minute ago, if you need to know the user's department and that didn't come from the application, then the policy decision point can figure that out by calling out to multiple policy information points. Ultimately, the PDP reaches a conclusion. It's either a yes or a no. It returns that back to the enforcement point, and the enforcement point enforces the decision, hence its name. So if it's a yes permit, it's going to go forth with the business request. If it's a no deny, it's a bit more interesting. You could decide how to handle the exceptions or the negative cases. Are you going to return a message to the end user? Are you going to return an exception or an error code? You can choose how to handle the deny.
Yeah, a couple points to be made here, David. One is the administration points at the bottom here.
Yep.
That's more of an offline process.
Right.
Everything else you described is part of the runtime environment. And the second thing to say here is that while the basic ABAC model is more, the answer is permit or deny, it's very binary, we have made extensions to this to apply it to different scenarios, like for databases, filtering, for listing things. And we have other webinars on those topics, but just wanted to call that out here as well.
Before you switch, there's one more point I want to make from a deployment perspective. All the different components in the ABAC architecture are very loosely coupled, which means a couple different things. It means that you can have, number one, a single point of management to any, or PAP, policy administration points, to any number of policy decision points. From a single point of management, you can manage multiple authorization engines. And given that the authorization engines are stateless, you can actually have multiple behind the load balancer, so you can scale up your architecture by adding more policy decision points, and you can serve any number of policy enforcement points from a single policy decision point. So you can start seeing the architecture grow. You had, say, 1 PAP, 10 PDPs, and per PDP you had another 10 policy enforcement points, so now you have 100 applications being protected, so it scales extremely well. And the last point I want to make on the architecture is that the nature or the form factor of the enforcement point can be very different. It depends on what you're protecting. So that's one of the key benefits of ABAC. When you mentioned externalized authorization earlier, I said that Spring Security was a way of doing it as well, and Microsoft claims and many other frameworks. ABAC is unique in the sense that it provides you with the model to apply the same consistent externalized authorization to a wide range of technologies, from Java apps, .NET apps, Ruby, Python, homegrown apps, off-the-shelf apps, SAP, so on and so forth. It's and you can go all the way down to databases and the network stack as well.
Right. So it's a general framework, so it gives you all those benefits across a wide range of applications.
Correct.
Excellent. All right, so David, you were talking a little bit about RBAC, or role-based access control, earlier, and we often make some comparisons with RBAC against an attribute-based model, just because I just mentioned earlier, roles have been around for a long time, and it's a good reference point because people are familiar with it.
And they work well in many scenarios.
For many cases, absolutely. So NIST, while we talk about NIST and their ABAC, publication earlier. They also, of course, have put out a lot of research on role-based access control as far back as 1992, way before some of our times here.
Are you implying I was born after 1992?
Somewhere around there, I think. But it's also an ANSI standard, so it's certainly well represented in the industry. And as you said before, we're assigning permissions or entitlements to this role definition, such as principal, teacher, student, and so on. And then we grant or manage that access via that role definition instead of by the individual user ID, which predates roles even, using access control lists, for example.
And actually, the whole reason, or one of the main reasons for role-based access control, was to simplify management. It was too difficult to maintain the access control list, so a level of abstraction with the roles was a way to go forward.
And we still see that to be the case today.
Oh, yeah.
When you look at most user provisioning systems, the primary attribute and use there is the role to set up email and other basic accounts and so on. So it definitely gives those kind of administrators a lot of leverage over large populations of users.
Yep.
And it does provide some segregation of duty controls. That's often an issue for many organizations from a compliance perspective or just a business risk perspective. But it's also somewhat static in nature, but there is some capability there. But limitations, there are a few, and we won't go into this extensively, and you likely are familiar with some of these. The whole concept of role engineering is a fair amount of effort for a lot of organizations to do that role mining. And we did mention earlier that those role definitions and those permission combinations, they're somewhat static in nature. And with today's businesses being so dynamic, so fast changing, that's often an issue that can slow them down. We have seen issues with scalability, the whole role explosion scenario, and there's many, many examples of that, because as the requirements get more complex, if you have to add more role definitions, that's where the scalability issue comes in.
And it's also scalability from an access review perspective, because if users inherit multiple roles, say 50, from a human perspective, for the manager to review that particular employee's permissions is nearly mission impossible. There's no way you could understand 50 roles and whether there are any conflicts between those 50 roles.
Right, that's a difficult concept. Now, I think you talked about this too, where RBAC focuses really on the user, on the subject, and in and of itself does not take these other parameters or attributes into context. That's typically, again, the work of the application itself, where they have the developers written the logic right into the application to take into account maybe time of day, location, or that other kind of context. So that's one of the things that ABAC, as we said earlier, is trying to address by handling that access logic separate from the application.
Yep.
All right, now David, what about implementing ABAC? What's that look like? Obviously people are familiar with roles, from a developer, from a policy author. What's this look like?
So before we get into the life cycle, there's something I want to bring up that one of our customers told us recently in a quote that you really liked, and that's the fact that ABAC puts the control back into the hands of the business. So it's the authorization not driven by the IT entitlements team, but by the application owners and the business owners. And the implementation lifecycle is about giving the control to the business owners, making them walk through a lifecycle or a series of steps that will put them back in control. And it starts off with defining the use case. At a high level, what is it you're doing? Are you building a new customer portal? Are you opening up your data centers? Are you implementing an export control regulation? Many, many different use cases across the industries based on the industry you're in. If you're in finance, Dodd-Frank is one of the legislations we're seeing being implemented using ABAC. So you define your use case, you scope it out, you want to make sure that it's well scoped out because you want to have a reasonably sized ABAC project. You don't want to go overboard because you're not going to be able to implement it. So the next step, once you have your use case, is to define the authorization requirements. So if you're doing export control as an example, what are the authorization requirements? Well, it could be that someone in Canada, be it a US citizen or be it a non-US citizen, cannot view information in the United States because you're not within the US, as an example.
Or privacy regulations that are often very country specific.
Absolutely. Yep.
And in Europe, the GDPR is underway right now, so that's those are also kinds of requirements that indicate that you need to know specific things about, okay, where is the user located, where is the customer data located, or what country is it associated with. So those are great examples.
Correct. Actually, speaking of privacy, the EU implemented a series of privacy laws, and there's new ones that came out in the past year. One of them is to give users the control of their information. So a requirement here would be an employee of a consumer-facing service, say a bank or an insurance, can view the information of a customer if the customer has granted access to that particular employee. So you want to gather those requirements in plain old English, really. It shouldn't be difficult. It's straight requirements from your business analysts, from the application owners. And once you've done that, what you want to do in step 3 here is identify the building blocks, identify the attributes that make up those requirements. If you say that employees can view PII for a given customer, what's employee? That's going to be a role. View is going to be an action. PII is going to be a type of resource, so on and so forth. So you build up, effectively, your attribute dictionary. You're defining what it is you need. And in the process of doing that, you also want to define where they come from. A LDAP, a database, an Active Directory, so on. Once you've defined your building blocks, you can revisit the authorization requirements in step 4, and finally break down the requirements into the policy. So you're going to be writing the authorization policies. And if you've done the first 3 steps, doing step 4 should be child's play. It should be very simple to rewrite the requirements into the ABAC policies. After you've written your policies, you want to go through a series of testing like you would code. You write code, you test code. You could even do test-driven policy authoring, where you start by defining your tests and then you implement your policies. It's very important to get the acceptance tests right up front when you define the authorization requirements, so that when you run the tests, you can show that you're compliant with the original requirements.
And that's the topic of the next webinar, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's all about XACML testing.
Yep, we're gonna. Yes, we're gonna do a bootcamp webinar at the end of the month. It's going to be a hands-on techie webinar like I like them, and we're going to have a special guest for this webinar out of our Sweden home base. One of our partners will be joining us and showing us how he's automated testing.
Great. I had to plug that one for you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this shameless plug.
Absolutely.
And I've heard that it's the end of the advertisement, and back to the webinar. So the next step after testing the policies is deploy the architecture. The architecture is the one we saw from an abstract standpoint a couple slides ago, PAP, PEP, PDP. You want to identify which applications you want to protect, how you want to protect them, how you want to intercept the business flow and enforce the decisions. It might be that instead of doing binary authorization like I initially mentioned, you might want to do filtering or data masking or data filtering like you mentioned, Jerry. Once you've deployed the architecture, all you have to do is press the red button and deploy the policies, and whew, the policies are sent out to the different authorization engines. Like you said, the actual policies can reside in multiple locations. They could be central, they could be local, or it could be a hybrid model. It could be authorization as a service to some degree if you deployed your authorization in the cloud. And to close the loop, Jerry, we do need to do one more step, and this is the space for another shameless plug if you want to put it in there. You want to do access reviews.
That's right, because that's always part of a good life cycle here, that we validate, again, not just from the testing perspective, but from the access review and certification point of view. We want to make sure that the policies are operating appropriately, and then make any adjustments that we need, and then cycle that back through the process. Or, of course, if you're adding new applications, new APIs, then you just repeat this cycle. So it's a very repetitive kind of thing. You use it for each kind of application or resource, and we just cycle through this. Although I must say, most of our customers find that once they've implemented ABAC for an application, the system is fairly stable, right? It doesn't change that often.
The processes don't change, and once they've identified their process of gathering requirements, implementing policies, it's relatively smooth from there on.
Excellent. So there is some upfront investment, of course, of resources and time, but then you get all the benefits.
It pays off.
Speaking of benefits, so there are some different business and technical benefits we'll mention or reinforce here. And I want to start, David, with some business drivers. So we might ask, well, why are we doing all this to begin with? But why are we going down this technology journey?
Who wants to do security, really?
Right.
It's overrated.
Well, maybe not so much. But when we look at so many of the use cases that you were talking about across different industries, it's come down to collaboration in many of those scenarios. We're in a need to share kind of world. And what are we sharing? Well, it's typically the most sensitive, the most valuable, the most important, the most regulated data. That's where the business value is. And making it available to customers, to partners, the supply chain, and so on.
There's really, I see at least two big use cases in the need to share. One of them is giving the information out to the consumers, to the ones who own the information. So if you're an insurance company building a consumer portal so that consumers can log in and view their claims and view their data so they can interact with the data, and that adds value, of course, to the insurance company as an example. But it could also be extremely expensive industries where you have to collaborate with universities, with research labs, with competitors.
Joint ventures.
Joint ventures, yeah. So pharmaceuticals, the oil industry, these are great examples. The defense industry as well are great examples of where collaboration is needed in order to advance your business.
Right. But in so many of these cases, it's not just that business requirement, but also there's some kind of regulatory compliance.
Yes.
We mentioned that with regard to privacy earlier. So these are often changing. They seem to get stricter every time. And also they can be very specific to a locale, to a country, even within a country, to different states or provinces. So these are very complex to try to implement. So that's a couple of examples. And then there's many cases where an organization wants to improve security, that they've used a group or role-based model in the past, and it actually allows too much access, and they want to enhance the security from that perspective. And also be able to enforce consistently across applications. So you talk about ABAC being a generalized framework where we can apply it to different kinds of applications, and if we do that, then we get more consistent access control across that domain.
Yep. A good example of lack of security is one of our customers a couple of years back had implemented role-based access control. It had implemented for many years, and one of their roles was a purchaser role, and the other one was an approver role. So the segregation of duty check that they wanted to do was that you cannot approve a purchase you've done. And for as long as you did not inherit the two roles, it was fine. And in the stores of that particular customer, where they had enough headcount, they could have purchasers on the one side, on the one hand, and approvers on the other. So fine, good segregation of duty. It worked great. But in smaller stores where the headcount was not that big, they needed people to wear two hats. Well, guess what happened? People started approving their own purchases. Now with ABAC, you can let approvers buy and purchasers approve so long as they don't approve their own stuff. So you can dynamically implement the segregation of duty check within your policy through a relationship check.
Excellent. And that was a huge benefit for them.
Correct.
Sure. All right, so we talked about a few things that here are sort of the sticks, of the carrot and stick model. But on the positive side, we find that ABAC can really help businesses respond faster to changing market conditions. So they can introduce services, new services. They can make adjustments to existing products or services faster than they could if all the security controls are hard-coded in the application.
And we have a great example of an insurance company, health insurance company out in Switzerland, implementing a new customer portal and applying authorization in depth in different layers to make sure that only the relevant information was shared in the web portal with the relevant customers.
Right, and there was a huge cost savings for them
as
well. So we like to say, that an ABAC model can really help enable what we call the policy-driven organization. All right, so David, a few benefits here to mention. As you said earlier, I really like this first one, putting the business in control of their own assets, not only from a security perspective, but also from a risk management perspective, because the business owners, they really should know the ramifications for handling that critical data, whether it's customer data or intellectual property of the company. And you can take this burden off the IT department and really make the operation of the business a lot more streamlined. And then second here, David, because the ABAC framework and architecture is one that's more general in nature, then we can say we can make the authorization system more future-proof.
Correct.
Right? Because we can accommodate different kinds of macro industry trends as they come along, whether it's cloud computing, big data, Internet of Things, whatever macro trend happens out there in the industry, it forces us to re-evaluate, right, reanalyze our security controls based on those kind of trends. Well, with a more generalized framework, then we're not as impacted by those changes, right?
And that's due to the fact that you've decoupled the decision-making process and the policy that it uses from the enforcement, and the enforcement is going to be technology specific. You're going to have an enforcement point for IoT or big data, but the policies, they don't change, they don't evolve.
Right, good point. And then finally on this slide here, improving the customer experience, or otherwise known as business transformation. And this is all about what you said earlier, getting people access to data, to services, in a much more streamlined way, much more efficient way, through APIs, through data services, and the like.
The one trend we're seeing, independently of authorization for now, is the fact that consumers are expecting information on mobile, not just on web portals anymore. Web portals are so 2000s really. Now we're in the 2010s, so it's time to get your mobile app. And one of the easiest ways of doing that is to build APIs, lightweight APIs that give you JSON, and then a mobile app, or even actually single-page applications that are mobile-friendly, so you don't even need to build the app anymore. When you do this, you want to have an authorization engine in the middle that will make sure that only the right information is being shared with the mobile app, with the single-page application.
Right, so we can really have that access anytime, from any device, from anywhere.
Right, AAA.
Perfect. Okay, what about on the technical side? This is really your area here. What do you think about some of the technical benefits?
So one of the ones that I like the most is the fact that with a single decision engine, you can do consistent authorization and consistent access control across multiple layers. Very often when we talk to customers, we tell them that ABAC helps you do any depth authorization. You can plug your enforcement point within your presentation tier for better user experience. You can plug it into the API tier to control access to your APIs. You can plug it into the business processes or ESB. You can plug it into your database. So anywhere you like, but no matter where you plug it in, it always goes back to the same logical authorization engine for that authorization decision, which means that you apply the same authorization checks consistently across your stack, both across in depth, but also across in breadth, across the different applications you might have, homegrown, off the shelf, so on and so forth. It also means that if you've externalized successfully authorization, like you did authentication, then you can save time on development. And if you think about it, Jerry, if you were to write an app today, would you rewrite authentication and implement username and password in your app?
No, I think similar to the authorization space, authentication is so dynamic right now.
Yep.
There's so much research and development and innovation happening in authentication. I would never hard code that into the application today.
And some of the horror stories that are most popular, of course, is people implementing their own authentication, the database being compromised, the password stored in the clear, the passwords being read, and then you've been pawned. Well, it's the same with authorization. Why would you want to implement authorization? Well, no, you don't want to do that. And guess what? Application developers, they don't like to deal with security. They'd rather focus on the bottom line, on the value to the app. So they'd rather focus on the app development, be faster at it, be better at it, add more features more quickly. The third technical benefit to ABAC is that if we go back to one of the points we made about policies, we said that policies were more readable. Okay, so what? Well, it makes it easier to audit because the auditors are going to be reading your policies. They're going to be verifying that what you did is correct. Because at the end of the day, if you do security, it's really for the auditors and no one else. They're the ones who hold you accountable to the security measures you put in place, so they're the ones you need to please.
Well, they often ask those difficult to answer questions, sort of like being in a deposition.
Right.
You know, well, what is happening in this application? Well, in many cases, you have to read the source code to try to figure that out, and that's certainly not human readable for most of us.
No, and then if you don't have the application developer or someone who knows that language, then it's game over. So policies simplify that task. And the last technical benefit relates to how easy it is to change the policies. Typical development life cycles are sprint-based, at least in agile companies, and sprints have a certain length. Before my current time at Axiomatics at British Telecom, we had 3-month or 90-day sprints, which meant that if we wanted to make a change in code, we'd have to wait for 90 days before we could roll it out. So that was actually relatively fast for a company that size,
absolutely,
but still relatively slow with respect to regulators. Now, if you can move away from code-based to policy-based, going back to what you said about the policy-based enterprise, then you can be more agile because you can change your policy more quickly, say every week or every month, and that's still saving 2 full months on the sprint that you had for your code.
Right. And that reminds me actually of a scenario a customer described to us where at certain times of the year, they actually have code freezes for the application.
Mm-hmm.
But because they have externalized the authorization, they can still make changes to those policies during those code freeze times, so they can still keep up with those business requirements.
Yep.
So that's just another benefit.
Any industry in the retail business is going to have a code freeze from, say, the end of October roughly till after Christmas, because you don't want your systems to go down during the biggest shopping season of the year. Yep.
Excellent. All right, David. So that wraps up our content portion here, but I wanted to highlight some additional resources. So a lot of this content from today we have in different kinds of white papers and other content on the website. So you can go there to the resources tab and find a lot more really good information. And here's a list of some of the more recent white papers that we've published. Here, some of the technical aspects, but also, for example, the building the business case for ABAC. So we invite you to check out that content. Also, the webinars like this one, we record the webinars and post them on the website, so you can see some of the recent ones here around Spring Security. So you mentioned that earlier.
Correct.
Creating policy enforcement points, that's so easy today with the SDK, or of course with using JSON and REST. A lot of really good material here for you to check out as well. And then finally, David, what you guys have recently been doing on the blog is to have a question of the week.
Correct.
I think these are really great. Sometimes you have little code snippets in there, some examples, and actually we take questions from customers too, right? And turn them into these kind of blog posts, right?
We do, and we publish one a week. We typically have a 2 to 3 week lead time, so we start writing the question 3 weeks ahead of time. So if you send us a question today, within 3 to 4 weeks, you might actually have the answer on the blog.
What's coming up next? Do you remember?
Yes, it was about negative logic in XACML policies. So it was a very technical XACML specific topic, and that question of the week was written by one of our newest and sales engineers in the federal sector who's been working a lot on XACML and government customers.
Excellent. All right, so we definitely look forward to hearing about other questions from customers and see what you guys put out there.
Yep.
And then, of course, we're often at different kinds of events. So Nordic APIs, it's coming up pretty soon.
Yes, it'll be at the end of October in the beautiful Stockholm, Sweden.
Yeah, so Travis Spencer, our old friend and colleague, he does a great job with organizing that event. There's also an identity management event in London in November, just a one-day event. We'll be there as well. And then back here in the US at the Gartner Identity Access Management Conference at the very end of November. So hope to see you there at one of those events as well.
Unfortunately, we can't really talk much about the last event because, what happens in Vegas.
Yes, right. So you have to be there to learn more about it. All right. So David, I think we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A here from the audience. So if you do have a question, please do submit it into the GoToWebinar box. And why don't we start with this first one here, David?
It's a great question, isn't it? Is it possible to query the policies to get a list of resources? In a lot of ABAC samples, we see policies such as a subject could do an action on a specific resource. And then the question, like you said, Jerry, would be a binary question. You know, can user X do action Y on resource Z? But here the poster is asking whether it's possible to imagine policies that let us ask which resources a subject can view or do a given action on.
Right, so it's not so much about the policy, right? The policy would be the same in any example. It's
right.
really how you ask the question.
Yep.
And we sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier in the presentation, where in the example standard, it would not be possible to do this unless you had a program, I guess, that cycled through every possible combination of questions.
Correct.
Right? It's not a very efficient way to process that kind of request.
So if you're dealing with, say, 100 different items or less, or even 1,000 or less, then you could actually do it the direct binary way. But generally, you would go for...
Yeah, we've extended the standard in this example to be able to ask an open-ended question. And in this case, if the question is which resources a subject can view or do some other kind of action on, then we would basically say, well, here is the subject, fill in the rest of the blanks.
Right.
Because then you could get back the conditions for accessing resources, maybe in the same department or the same location or some relationship concept.
So that's,
and then what you could also list then what actions can I do on those resources? Can I view them? Can I transfer them? Can I publish them, etc.?
So let's walk through an example. In the webinar earlier, we said that teachers can enter a classroom that belongs to their department. So you could do the following. Number one, can Alice enter classroom 1? That's a direct binary question. The policy decision point is going to look up Alice's department. She's in the physics department. The policy decision point is also going to look up the department for classroom 1. It's also the physics department, so we're going to get a yes back. Now, going back to the question we have here, we could also send an open-ended question, a reverse query, and it would be, which classroom can Alice enter? You could also flip it around. You could also ask, who can enter classroom 1? So it doesn't have to be user-centric. It could actually be resource-centric as well.
Right.
And to your point, Jerry, the answer will come back in terms of conditions that must be fulfilled. So if we look at the question, which classroom can Alice enter? We know the user, so we can determine their department. They're in the physics department. Therefore, the classroom must be in the physics department. So that's the condition that comes back over to you. But you could also say something like, who can paint classroom number 3? Or who can paint? And then the answer, hopefully, would be either the arts teacher or the janitor painting the classroom over the summer period.
Right. Okay, so that's a great question. Good examples there. Another question we have here that often comes up is around performance. So we've talked about this reference architecture that introduces some new modules that are now outside the application. And sometimes people are concerned that that's going to impact performance. How do we address that?
Right. So as soon as you mention the word externalizing, there's that fear factor, that FUD that comes in. Oh my God, you're externalizing, it's going to be more expensive. It's not necessarily the case. It might be. Let's be honest. It might be that if you do security, you might actually have a performance impact. That's true. No security is free. Authentication is not free either. Logging is not free either. There is potentially a performance impact. But more importantly, what I want to stress is that externalizing or decoupling or going for a microservice trend where you break down your application into different modules, it makes the performance visible. So now you understand where the performance comes from, or lack thereof, which module is responsible for which cost, which means that you can also optimize each and every module. Now, in the case of authorization, in the architecture, you have your PEP, PEP to PDP call. That could be one performance point. You also have your PDP to PIP point. They could be a performance place as well. And there's techniques to enhance the performance to make it potentially even more efficient than what your app would have been otherwise.
Yeah, so there, certainly the way you describe the architecture and scaling it up with multiple components, there's lots of ways to address the performance concerns, but it's something that comes up, so we appreciate that question as well here. Well, David, I think we should wrap it up here and close the call. Thanks. It's good to be here in person with you.
Face to face.
Right?
Yep.
Doesn't happen too often. And,
I had to dress up for this one, though.
Yeah, you did. Thanks for getting up so early.
Thank you. Thank you, too.
Thanks, everyone, for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar or at one of those events that we mentioned earlier. Thanks again very much.
Thank you. Bye now.